I want to start with the smell. Not the smell of war. Not the smell of plasma cannons or scorched hull plating or the particular chemical stench that alien blood leaves on concrete floors. I want to start with the smell of garlic frying in oil, because that's what hits you first when you step into the lower kitchens of the Vale Dominion, and that's where everything that matters in this story actually begins. I've been asked, probably 40 or 50 times now, to explain how a man like Marcus Hale ended up cooking for an alien fleet commander. And every single time I try to answer that question, I realize I'm telling the wrong part first. People want the battle. They want the moment the whole thing cracked open. They want the scene in the command bay, the speech, the shockwave that rewrote everything we thought we understood about the Vale Confederation and humanity's place inside it. But if I skip the kitchen, you won't understand any of it. So, the smell of garlic. The lower kitchens of a Vale warship sit in the belly of the vessel, 4 decks below the command spine, 2 decks above the engine core. They're designed for function, not comfort. Gray alloy walls, overhead lighting strips that run slightly too blue for human eyes, long prep counters made from a ceramic compound that Vale metallurgists swear is superior to anything Earth produces. It probably is. It's also cold to the touch, in a way that makes your fingers ache after 20 minutes of working against it. The ventilation ducts are efficient but noisy, a low, constant hiss that you stop consciously hearing after the first week, but that never actually leaves your body. I know this because 3 months after I left that ship, I woke up at 3 in the morning convinced someone had left a window open, and it took me a full minute to understand that the sound was in my memory, not my apartment. The kitchen staff were mostly Vale, 2 senior prep technicians named Sorrel and Adon, a junior food chemist called Vyerth who barely spoke to anyone, and then there were the 3 human auxiliaries who had been assigned to the vessel as part of the cultural integration program. There was Danny Ockhaffer, who handled breakfast rotation. There was Peter Vosch, who was technically listed as a sanitation auxiliary, but had talked his way into pastry production within 2 weeks. And there was Marcus. Marcus Hale. He was listed in the crew manifest as M. Hale, Human Auxiliary, Grade 3 Culinary Services. His identification badge had a picture of a man who looked vaguely tired, somewhere between 40 and 50, with a jaw that had been broken and reset at some point in the past, gray at his temples, and eyes that didn't quite match the exhausted expression on his face. The eyes were alert, the kind of alert that doesn't turn off. I didn't notice that for a long time. None of us did. My name is Kasha Verne. At the time of the events I'm describing, I was serving as a cultural liaison officer, 3rd tier, attached to Commander Valen Draw's personal staff. My job was to bridge communication gaps between the Vale crew and the human auxiliaries, handle any cultural misunderstandings before they became incidents, and file weekly integration reports to the Confederation's Cultural Affairs Division. It was not a glamorous assignment. It involved a lot of paperwork, a lot of awkward translation sessions, and more time than I would like to admit spent mediating arguments about food storage temperatures. The Vale Dominion was a Tier 1 command vessel, 1,200 meters from bow to stern. A crew complement of roughly 4,000, of which about 200 were human auxiliaries placed there as part of the Galactic Confederation's 5-year integration initiative. The idea, as it had been sold to both species, was simple in concept and complicated in practice. Put humans and Vale in close quarters, in working environments, give them shared tasks and shared responsibilities, and let familiarity do what diplomacy alone cannot. Break down the species barrier through proximity and common purpose. Commander Valen Draw commanded the Dominion with the particular brand of controlled authority that senior Vale officers seemed to wear like a second skin. She was tall. Most Vale are tall, but she was tall even by their standards, with the silver-gray coloring of the Vale northern regions and a set of secondary ocular membranes that she kept folded back when she was on the command deck, which senior Vale do as a deliberate signal of openness and attention. She was 37 years into her command career. She had seen 2 sector conflicts, 1 full-scale engagement with the Kreth sovereignty, and an incident near the Ember Belt that the Confederation still classifies at the highest level of restriction. She was not, in other words, naive. She was not unobservant. She was not the kind of person who missed things. And she completely missed Marcus Hale for 6 months. We all did. The first time I spoke to Marcus directly was in the 3rd week of the integration posting. I'd been making rounds through the auxiliary quarters, doing the informal check-ins that my role required, and I stopped by the kitchen station because Danny had filed a low-level complaint about the Vale prep technicians adjusting the temperature settings on the human food storage units without notification. Small thing. The kind of thing that needed 15 minutes and some mutual acknowledgement, not a formal incident report. Marcus was at the far end of the prep counter when I came in. He was working on what I would later learn was his own modification of a standard Vale protein ration. The Vale eat well, but their seasoning philosophy is, to put it charitably, minimalist, using a spice kit he'd apparently been permitted to bring as personal cargo. He was breaking down what looked like dried chilies, moving with a particular kind of efficiency. Not rushed, not showy. Just the movements of someone who has done a task so many times that the body handles it without consulting the brain. I introduced myself. He looked up, gave me a nod that was perfectly polite and told me absolutely nothing about him, and went back to what he was doing. I handled the storage unit situation with Sorrel, filed my notes, and left. In my report, I recorded Marcus Hale as well-adjusted, non-confrontational, minimal social friction. That assessment was accurate. It was also entirely incomplete, but I didn't know that yet. What I started noticing, what I think all of us started noticing, though none of us said anything about it, which is itself worth examining, was the way Marcus moved through the ship. Not the kitchen, on the ship, in corridors, in the common spaces, in the loading bays where the auxiliary staff had permission to take their exercise periods. He moved like someone who was continuously reading a room he'd never been in before, but without any of the anxiety that usually accompanies that kind of attention. It was a survey quality, a constant, quiet gathering of information. You'd catch him in conversation with another auxiliary, apparently relaxed, and then his eyes would drift to the ceiling, tracking a ventilation route, maybe, or noting where the emergency seal panels were located. And then he'd come back to the conversation without losing a beat. I mentioned it to Danny once, offhandedly. She shrugged and said Marcus was just that way, always aware, and that she figured it came from growing up in one of the northern reclamation zones. The post-war northern zones bred a certain kind of survivor alertness, she said. You learned to read spaces, read exits, read the way air moved through a building, because sometimes those things were the difference between walking out and not. I filed that explanation and more or less forgot it. This is something I think about a lot now. The integration program had been running for roughly 4 months when Commander Valen Dra began her habit of visiting the lower kitchens. This was unusual. Senior Vale officers do not, as a rule, spend time in the meal preparation areas. They receive their food, they consume it, they move on. Food is sustenance. The cultural relationship Vale have with eating is efficient rather than social. The idea of lingering in a kitchen is roughly as natural to a Vale officer as the idea of watching their fuel cells being charged. You know it happens, you're glad it happens, you don't need to watch. What brought Valen Dra to the lower kitchens was, according to what she told me later, pure pragmatic curiosity. She had been receiving positive reports about the auxiliary kitchen staff's contribution to crew morale. The human auxiliaries had apparently introduced modifications to the standard meal rotation that were improving engagement and reducing the low-grade irritability that long deployment tends to produce. She wanted to observe the source of this improvement directly. What she observed was Marcus. She came in on a Tuesday. Vale ships run on a standard cycle that maps loosely to Earth weeks, which was another one of the integration program's deliberate accommodations, during what the kitchen called the slow period between midday and evening prep. Most of the kitchen staff were on rest cycle. Marcus was alone, working on something that was not, as far as I could tell, any part of the standard meal rotation. He'd sourced a particular grain from the ship's botanical auxiliary section, a Vale equivalent of barley, though it cooks differently, and he was adapting it to a recipe that looked to me like a rough approximation of a Persian stew. Commander Valen Dra stood in the kitchen doorway for 4 minutes before Marcus acknowledged her. Not because he didn't know she was there. I want to be clear about that. I've thought about it carefully, talked to everyone who was present or who had access to the ship's sensor logs. Marcus knew she was there inside the first 30 seconds. The kitchen's entrance sensor registers a soft chime that's inaudible to Vale, but sits in a frequency range that human hearing picks up clearly. And Marcus had the kind of awareness, the room reading quality I mentioned earlier, that made it essentially impossible that he missed the commander of a 1,200-meter warship walking into a room he was occupying. He let her stand there for 4 minutes because he was deciding something. I'm certain of that now, I wasn't then. When he did acknowledge her, he did it sideways, didn't turn, just angled his head slightly and said, in standard Vale, "If you're going to stand there, you might as well sit. The grain needs another 8 minutes." This is, I should explain, not how one addresses a Vale fleet commander. The appropriate form of address involves the title prefix, the command designation, and a posture adjustment that signals subordinate status. What Marcus did was the equivalent, in human terms, of telling your general to pull up a chair because dinner isn't ready yet. Vailendra sat down. She told me later, and I've never forgotten her exact phrasing, that she sat down because the invitation was so completely devoid of calculation that it surprised her into compliance. She was used to being managed, used to the careful performance of deference that even her senior officers engaged in. The cook hadn't performed anything. He'd just made space. They talked while the grain cooked. Marcus's Vale was functional rather than refined, enough to communicate, with occasional gaps where he'd pivot to the hand signal system that Vale and humans had developed as a practical supplement to verbal translation. Valendra's English was better than she typically let on, which I discovered later was itself a kind of deliberate choice, a habit of understating her own capability in order to observe more accurately. From what I understand of that first conversation, they talked mostly about the grain, its properties, why adapting it required a different approach to heat timing than Earth grains, the way food behaved differently in ship atmosphere versus planetary atmosphere, dry, practical things, the stuff of cookery rather than diplomacy. But something shifted in that conversation that would not shift back. I don't know how to name it precisely. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It wasn't the romantic arc that some of the later accounts tried to impose on the story, which I think is both inaccurate and reductive. It was something more like recognition. Two people who were both very good at being present in a space without explaining themselves, suddenly aware that they were looking at someone else who worked the same way. Vailendra came back to the lower kitchens the following Tuesday. And the Tuesday after that. By the 5th week of these visits, Marcus had started preparing something specific for her. Not a full meal, just a small dish, whatever he was working on that day. The Vale diet is not identical to the human diet, but there's enough overlap in nutritional chemistry that cross-species sharing is generally safe, with some well-documented exceptions. Marcus seemed to understand those exceptions intuitively, or had done his research carefully enough that the result was the same. Sorrel mentioned it to me in passing, with the particular tone of someone who finds something fascinating but doesn't want to seem too interested. She said that watching the cook work for the commander was different from watching him work for the standard meal rotation. Not slower, not more elaborate, just more deliberate, like he was paying a different kind of attention to what he was doing. I asked Marcus about it once directly. It was a Wednesday, so not a kitchen visit day, and I caught him in the auxiliary common room during the off shift. I asked him what he thought of Commander Vailendra. He looked at me for a moment, that look, the one I came to recognize as him deciding how much to answer, and then he said, "She's honest." I waited for more, there wasn't more. "That's it," I said. "That's a lot," he said, and went back to what he was reading. I want to tell you about Earth in the years before Marcus Hale came aboard the Vale Dominion, because I think it's necessary context, and because I realize that for anyone encountering this record who wasn't there, the geography of that era might not be clear. The resource contraction began in 2041. By 2048, it had reorganized most of Earth's political geography in ways that the old pre-contraction nations would not have recognized. The Northern Hemisphere's food production zones had been fought over, ceded, retaken, partitioned, and renegotiated so many times that the concept of national ownership had essentially collapsed into a patchwork of governance zones administered by whoever currently controlled the infrastructure. The Southern Hemisphere had fared somewhat better in terms of resource retention, but had absorbed the bulk of the displacement population, which created its own category of crisis. In the middle of all of this, during what historians now call the Third Partition Period, a military coalition called the Northern Reclamation Alliance had emerged, and over the course of roughly 11 years, done something that most strategic analysts had considered structurally impossible. It had stabilized through a combination of force, negotiation, and a particular quality of command leadership that defied easy classification. A continuous territory spanning what had once been 4 separate nations and housing, at its peak, close to 90 million people. The commander of the Northern Reclamation Alliance went by the operational name Warlord. Not a title given by enemies, a title the Alliance itself had chosen, deliberately archaic, deliberately blunt, because the person in that role made decisions that no softer vocabulary could encompass. The campaigns under Warlord's leadership had ended the Third Partition. They had also, in some assessments, made the subsequent peace negotiations possible by making the alternative so clearly and precisely understood that the parties at the table had genuine motivation to find an agreement. When the Galactic Confederation made first meaningful contact with Earth in 2063, meaningful contact, not the previous 40 years of observed but unengaged monitoring, one of the conditions the Confederation had required before integration negotiations could proceed was full disclosure of Earth's military leadership structure. Earth's Provisional Governing Council had complied. All active command officers, all operational records, all strategic documentation. There was one exception. The Northern Reclamation Alliance's commanding officer had disappeared from the historical record approximately 8 months before the Confederation contact announcement. The alliance itself had formally dissolved, its territorial administration transferred to the Provisional Council. There was no further trace, in any official document, of the person who had commanded it. The Confederation had noted the gap. Their assessors had filed a report identifying it as an anomaly. The report had been reviewed, discussed, and ultimately deprioritized on the basis that whatever military command structures had existed during Earth's internal contraction period were no longer operationally relevant, given that Earth's Provisional Council had accepted full integration terms, which included standing down all independent military capability. The report had been filed, the anomaly had been noted. And then, because large bureaucracies are the same everywhere in the galaxy, the file had been placed in a queue, and the queue had been superseded by more immediate priorities, and nobody had followed up. There's a moment in every situation that later becomes a story, where the thing that seems small is actually the hinge. The detail that, if someone had paid different attention to it, would have changed everything that followed. I've spent a lot of time in the years since identifying where the hinges were in this story. There are several candidates. But if I'm honest, I think the one that mattered most was a maintenance request filed in month 5 of the integration posting. The lower kitchen's secondary ventilation array had been running at 92% capacity for about 3 weeks. Not a failure, 92% is within operational parameters, but enough of a variance from standard that the ship's automated maintenance system had flagged it for human inspection. These inspections are normally handled by the engineering auxiliaries. The work order had been misrouted, through some combination of administrative error and the particular inefficiency that multi-species bureaucracy produces, to the kitchen auxiliary roster. Marcus picked up the work order. He went to inspect the secondary ventilation array. This required access to a maintenance corridor that runs along the outer wall of the kitchen level and connects, through 3 junction points, to the ship's primary system spine. These corridors are not restricted. They're engineering access routes, designed to be usable by any crew member during normal operations. They're also, and this is the thing that the maintenance logs recorded but no one thought to analyze at the time, connected to a network of service passages that essentially maps the structural interior of the entire vessel. Marcus spent 4 hours in that maintenance corridor. The official log says he spent 40 minutes inspecting the ventilation array, identified a partial blockage in the intake filter, cleared it manually, and restored the array to 100% capacity. This is accurate. The rest of the time, as the sensor logs show if you look at them in the right sequence, and I have looked at them many times, he was moving through the service passage network. Systematically, not lost, not wandering. Moving through it the way someone moves through a space they are trying to understand, floor by floor, junction by junction, until the picture is complete. I asked him about this much later, after everything. I asked him what he'd been doing in those corridors. He said, learning the ship. Why, I asked. He looked at me with the look I'd come to understand meant he was deciding how honest to be, and then he said, because I've never been anywhere I didn't know the exits. The incident that began unraveling everything happened in month 6, on a Thursday, during what the ship's schedule listed as a standard patrol route through the Cathara margin, a stretch of space that the Confederation considers low risk, and that in most circumstances is. The margin runs along the outer boundary of Vale-controlled space, close enough to the Kreth sovereignty's nearest territorial boundary that there's occasional signal traffic, but far enough that engagement protocols don't typically activate. On this particular Thursday, a Kreth forward scout vessel dropped out of fold space approximately 8,000 kilometers off the Dominion's port bow. This is not in itself catastrophic. Forward scouts probe boundaries regularly. It's a standard element of the kind of low-grade mutual surveillance that species at contested borders engage in. The correct response is to run standard identification protocols, log the contact, and continue on course unless the scout takes an aggressive posture. What made this particular contact unusual was what came 17 minutes after the scout appeared. A Kreth combat formation, 3 heavy interceptors, and a support frigate dropped out of fold space in a coordinated pattern that put the Dominion at the center of a loose tactical bracket. Not an immediate attack posture, but not a neutral posture either. The Kreth like to describe this kind of formation as a conversation alignment, a positioning that suggests they want to talk, while also ensuring they could transition to something less conversational within about 40 seconds if the conversation didn't go their direction. The Dominion's command deck went to elevated alert. Commander Valen Dra took her station. Her tactical team ran the probability assessments. The formation was unusual in that the Kreth were violating the margin's unwritten standard protocol by using heavy interceptors rather than the scout variants that margin encounters typically involve. This could mean several things, and Valen Dra's tactical officers were actively arguing about which thing it meant when the Kreth broadcast came through. In simplified standard galactic, the Kreth commander identified himself as tactical adjudicator Vren Kos, described the formation as a matter of territorial inquiry, and requested an immediate meeting with the commander of the Vale vessel to discuss what he called unauthorized human military presence in the Cathara margin. Unauthorized human military presence. On the Dominion's command deck, every Vale officer in the room looked at each other. The human auxiliaries assigned to command functions. I was one of them. I was on shift that day, looked at each other, and then, collectively and more or less simultaneously, looked at Commander Valen Dra, because none of us had any idea what that phrase meant. There were no human military personnel on the Dominion. There were human auxiliaries, support staff, cultural liaisons, kitchen workers. The integration program explicitly prohibited military personnel from participating precisely because the Vale had insisted that having armed human forces aboard Confederation vessels would undermine the program's stated purpose of civilian integration. Valen Dra said very carefully, "Request clarification." The Kreth commander said, also very carefully, that his vessel's intelligence systems had detected a Level 7 threat signature from within the Dominion's hull. He said that a Level 7 threat signature was the Kreth classification for a military commander of proven engagement history. He said his systems were very good, and he trusted them. He said he would like to speak to whoever aboard the Dominion was generating that signature before he drew his own conclusions about what it meant. I want to pause here because I think it's important to understand what a Kreth Level 7 threat signature actually represents, and why everyone on that command deck went very still when Vren Kos mentioned it. The Kreth biological surveillance systems are not technological in the way most species understand technology. They're a product of their own particular evolutionary and cultural development, a form of directed sensory refinement that allows Kreth to detect, from significant distances, what they call command resonance. The concept is difficult to translate precisely. The closest approximation I can offer is that Kreth perceive, in the electromagnetic and bioelectric output of living beings, a quality that reflects accumulated command authority, not rank alone, not status. Something more specific than that, the particular neural and physiological signature that develops in a being who has made decisions under extreme pressure that resulted in the deaths of other beings, and who has continued making those decisions anyway, long enough that the pattern becomes structural rather than incidental. In Kreth taxonomy, this signature has 7 levels, Most military officers, even senior ones, register at levels 3 or 4. Level 5 is a significant conflict commander. Level 6 is a strategic architect, someone who has shaped the outcome of a major engagement across an extended period. Level 7 is something the Kreth don't have a clean single word for. Their term translates, roughly, as the one whose presence changes the weight of a room. In the history of Confederation-Kreth diplomatic interaction, a Level 7 reading on Kreth surveillance systems had been logged 14 times. Every single one of those 14 instances had involved a species-defining figure, a person whose actions had reshaped the political and physical geography of their world. Vren Kas was telling Commander Valen Dra that there was one of those people on her ship. The internal search took 47 minutes. I was part of the team that conducted it, along with 2 of Valen Dra's senior staff officers and the ship's security chief, a Vale named Orath who had the demeanor of someone who had seen everything and been mildly disappointed by all of it. We ran through the command deck personnel first, all Vale, all with clearance profiles that matched their positions. We ran through the senior auxiliary staff. We ran through the medical team, the engineering group, the communications auxiliaries. Nothing matched. Orath looked at the list. He was methodical. He went through the remaining categories. Kitchen staff. He stopped at M. Hale, Human Auxiliary, Grade 3, Culinary Services, and said flatly, "We should talk to him." I remember thinking, Marcus, that doesn't make any sense, and I remember the thought crossing my mind a fraction of a second later, but his eyes, though. "We found him in the kitchen." Of course we did. It was his shift. He was prepping the evening meal rotation, doing something complicated with the Vale equivalent of legumes and what smelled like a common-adjacent spice he'd sourced from somewhere. The kitchen was otherwise empty. Sorrel and Adon were on rest cycle. Vyerth was in the food chemistry lab, and Marcus was alone with the low hiss of the ventilation and the sound of something softening in a pot. He didn't look up when we came in, but he said in a completely even voice, "I figured it'd be about the Kreth scanner." The silence that followed that sentence is one of the most complete silences I have ever experienced in my life. Orath recovered first, which I give him full credit for. He said, "You're aware of the contact." Marcus said, "I picked up the alert when it came through the kitchen's secondary comm panel. The Kreth are good at what they do. I knew there'd be an inquiry." I found my voice. "Marcus, what are you? Who are you?" He put down the spoon he'd been using, turned around, and I saw, for maybe the first time, what had been in front of me for 6 months without me actually seeing it. The jaw that had been broken and reset. The way he stood, which was not the way kitchen workers stand, but the way people stand who have spent years making themselves the most stable point in an unstable situation. The eyes that were alert in a way that didn't turn off. He said, "You probably need to get Commander Valen Dra." She came to the kitchen. I thought she might send a security escort, have him brought to a formal room, handle it in the structured way that command authority typically handles this kind of situation. Instead, she came herself, without escort, and she came to the kitchen because, I think, some part of her had already understood that whatever was about to happen needed to happen in a space where the weight of rank and protocol was slightly less absolute than it would be on the command deck. Marcus was sitting at the counter when she arrived. He turned off the pot. He had his hands flat on the ceramic surface, not clenched, not hidden, just visible. I've thought about that gesture a lot. It was the gesture of someone who knows that what their hands do in the next few minutes is going to be read carefully, and who is choosing, deliberately, to make them completely readable. Valen Dra stood across from him. She didn't say anything immediately. I'd seen her handle complex situations before, and I knew that silence for her was usually a gathering, a moment of pulling all the available information into a working picture before she spoke. Then she said, "Tell me." 2 words flat, not angry, not afraid, just tell me. And Marcus told her. He talked for a long time. I've heard people confess things before in various contexts. I grew up in a diplomatic family, spent years in environments where things that had been hidden eventually came into the light, and there's usually a quality of release to it, an unburdening, like the person telling the truth has been carrying something heavy and is finally putting it down. Marcus didn't have that quality. He told the truth the way he cooked, efficiently, without waste, with the particular attention of someone who understands that the details matter and that getting them wrong, even the small ones, produces something that doesn't nourish anyone. He had been born in what had been called, before the contraction, the southern edge of a country in the northern hemisphere. He had grown up in the reclamation zones. He had been in the first set of territorial conflicts. As a teenager, then as a young man, then as someone who had spent enough time in those conflicts to understand that what was happening needed organization, needed coherent leadership, needed someone to do the work that nobody with a clear self-preservation instinct would volunteer for. He had not intended to become what he became. He was emphatic about this, not in a self-excusing way, but in the specific way of someone who has thought carefully about the difference between intention and consequence, and is not interested in using intention as a substitute for accountability. He had stepped into a role because the alternative was watching something collapse that he believed could be held. And then he had held it for 11 years. The casualty figures from the Northern Reclamation Alliance's campaigns are a matter of public record. I looked them up after this conversation, and I looked them up again many times afterward. Somewhere between 40 and 70,000 dead on all sides of the various engagements across the 11-year period. The uncertainty in that range is itself a product of the contraction era's record-keeping failures. Marcus knew the numbers. He said them without flinching, and without the particular weight some people put on casualty figures to demonstrate their own suffering about the suffering of others. He said them with the flat specificity of someone for whom those numbers have never, for a single day, become abstract. Valen Draw listened without interrupting. When he was done talking about the campaigns, he talked about the dissolution, the decision to stand the alliance down, the peace process and his understanding, which he described in careful terms, that his continued visible presence in any role would complicate the negotiations, because there were parties at the table for whom the Warlord designation was a provocation that couldn't be managed, and that his disappearance was therefore the most useful thing he could contribute to the peace he'd spent 11 years fighting for. He had spent 18 months in a deliberate disengagement from any identifiable public existence. Then the integration announcement had come. And he had, and this is the part I think about most, applied to the auxiliary program. Not because he was trying to hide, not because the kitchen was cover for something operational. He applied because the integration program was humanity's most significant collective undertaking in the post-contact period. And he believed, based on what he knew about how large institutions absorbed new members, that the program needed people in it who understood how institutions worked from the inside, who could see structural problems before they became catastrophic failures, and who could do so without drawing the kind of attention that would politicize their presence. He had been watching the program from a prep counter for 6 months. "And what have you seen?" Valen Draw asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 3 things that worry me and 2 things that don't. What happened next was not what anyone would have predicted. Valen Draw did not contact Confederation Command. She did not place Marcus in secure holding. She did not initiate the formal reporting protocols that technically required her to escalate any discovery of undisclosed human military identity to the Integration Oversight Board within 6 hours of detection. She said, "Tell me the 3 things that worry you." And Marcus told her, "I was taking notes, which was my job, and I've gone over those notes so many times that I can reproduce them close to verbatim." The 3 concerns he raised were structural rather than personal. They were about the way the integration program's cultural framework had been designed, the specific vulnerabilities it had created in species relationship protocols, and one thing that he described as a potential flashpoint that nobody had modeled because the people doing the modeling hadn't spent enough time below decks. The 3rd concern was the one that Valen Draw focused on. The integration program placed human auxiliaries in support roles: kitchen, sanitation, medical assistance, low-tier communications, on the basis that these roles were low sensitivity and therefore appropriate for a first-stage integration where trust was still being established. What the program's designers had not fully accounted for was that these roles were also the ones with the highest proximity to every other crew member. Kitchen staff see everyone. They know the rhythms of the ship better than the people running it. They know who eats how much before a stressful day and who doesn't eat at all. They know which officers are managing their workload and which ones aren't sleeping. They know the mood of 4,000 people from the way 4,000 people behave in the most honest room on any ship, which is the one where the food is. Marcus had been conducting, from the lower kitchen of the Vale Dominion, a continuous and comprehensive assessment of crew cohesion, command functioning, stress distribution, and operational readiness. Not because he'd been ordered to, because he didn't know how to stop. 6 months, Valendraw said. You've been here 6 months. Yes. And in that time, what is your assessment of the readiness of this vessel? He gave it to her, straight. Numbers and observations and 3 specific recommendations delivered in the flat, direct style of a professional who knows that the person across from him needs the real answer, not a softened version of it. When he finished, Valendraw was quiet for a while. Then she said something I've thought about constantly since. In 11 years of command, no one has ever given me an accurate assessment without being asked for one first. The situation outside had not resolved itself while we were having this conversation. Vrenkos was still out there with his 3 heavy interceptors and his support frigate, sitting in a loose tactical bracket and apparently exercising the particular patience that Kreth commanders deploy as itself a form of pressure. They weren't moving. They weren't escalating. They were waiting. Orath had been managing the communication loop with the bridge, feeding updates through to Valendraw via her earpiece. And at approximately the 2-hour mark of our kitchen conversation, he came to the doorway and said, in the careful tone of someone who has information they need to deliver but is uncertain of the room's temperature, that Vrenkos had transmitted a second message. The second message was addressed, in standard galactic, not to the commander of the Vale Dominion, but to the Level 7 signature currently aboard. To Marcus, in other words. Valendraw looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the message header that Orath was displaying on his wrist unit. Something passed across his face, not quite emotion, but the shadow of a decision being made, which in someone with his particular discipline was the closest thing to visible emotion you were likely to get. He said, "What does it say?" Orath read it. The Kreth commander acknowledged that the Level 7 individual was present in an apparently non-military capacity, which he described as a situation of significant historical interest. He extended, in formal Kreth diplomatic construction, a request for direct communication. He noted that the Kreth sovereignty maintained a specific category of diplomatic relationship, distinct from standard species-to-species engagement, which they extended only to beings who registered at level 6 or above. He called it, in translation, the conversation between commanders. And he said that he would, with the Dominion's permission, like to have that conversation. I want to describe the quality of the silence on the command deck when this message was relayed there, because I went up to the command deck after we received it, and the silence was extraordinary. 4,000 people on a 1,200-meter warship, and the command deck felt like the only room in the universe at that moment. Valendraw's senior officers were at their stations. The human auxiliaries who were on command deck rotation were at theirs. Everyone was doing their job, running their systems, maintaining the operational function of the vessel. But the attention in that room had a specific texture, the kind of attention that forms when every person in a space is holding the same unasked question. Valendraw came to the command deck. She stood at the center console, and she looked at the tactical display showing Vrenkos's formation, and then she turned to her communications officer and said, "Patch the secondary comm to the lower kitchen." Her communications officer, a Vale named Tessivan who had served with Valendraw for 12 years, and had, in that time, developed the ability to project absolute neutrality in moments of significant surprise, said, "Patching now, Commander." She turned to me, "Go down, translate if he needs it." I went down. Marcus was standing at the kitchen counter. He turned the ventilation down to its quietest setting, something I didn't understand until I realized he was doing it so that the ambient noise wouldn't interfere with the communication quality. The small, automatic adjustments of someone who is permanently thinking about the conditions of the space he's operating in. I told him the commander had patched the secondary comm. He nodded. He sat down, which surprised me. I'd expected him to stand. Standing is the natural posture for a formal communication. But he sat, the way he always sat, with a particular kind of settled weight that wasn't relaxation exactly, but was something that occupied the same space as relaxation without being it. He opened the channel. Vrenkas's voice came through, high, precise, with the particular harmonic layering that Kreth used for formal modes of address. His translator rendered it in standard galactic first, then in English. "I am speaking to the Level 7 presence." Marcus said, You are currently serving as a kitchen worker." Marcus said, "Yes." A pause. "This is unusual." Marcus said, "Most things I've done are from the outside." Another pause, longer this time, and I thought I heard something in the quality of the Kreth commander's voice shift. Something that might have been, if the Kreth have the equivalent of it, amusement, or respect, or whatever sits at the intersection of those two things. "Our protocols require that I ask you directly," Vrenkas said. "Are you operating in a military capacity aboard this vessel?" "No." "Are you acting under any command authority that supersedes your current stated role?" "No." "Are you gathering intelligence for any external party with hostile intent toward the Confederation or its member vessels?" "No." The questions had the quality of a ritual, formal, required, possibly ancient in their form. Marcus answered each one in the same flat, undecorated tone, and each answer landed with the particular weight of something that was simply true and knew it. Then Vrenkas said something that was not part of any ritual I could identify. He said, "Why?" Marcus understood what he was asking. I could see it in the slight pause he took, not an uncertain pause, but a considering one. "Why the kitchen?" "Why any of this?" Vrenkas said. "You commanded 90 million people. Your war record puts you in a category that most civilizations mark with statues, and you are here making food." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because the people I fed tonight will work better tomorrow, and the ship will run better. And if this integration program produces what it's supposed to produce, it becomes the model for how the next phase of contact gets handled. And I've spent 11 years learning that the things that look small are usually the ones that matter most." Vrenkas was quiet for so long that I checked the comm to see if the connection was still active. Then he said, "I would like to formally register on behalf of the Kreth sovereignty a Category 1 diplomatic acknowledgement of your presence aboard this vessel. This does not constitute a threat or a claim. It constitutes a record." Marcus said, "Understood." And the Kreth commander said, and his tone shifted into something that felt almost personal, "The dish you were preparing when we interrupted, did it turn out well?" Marcus looked at the pot on the counter. He'd turned it back on at some point. The kitchen smelled like cumin and the particular dark richness of slow-cooked legumes. He said, "I think so. Give it another 20 minutes." The Kreth formation withdrew approximately 4 hours later. Vrenkas transmitted a formal departure acknowledgement to Commander Valen Dra, standard protocol, and added a single non-standard line. "The commander of the Northern Reclamation Alliance has earned Category 1 diplomatic recognition from the sovereignty. This acknowledgement is permanent and unconditional." Valen Dra read the transmission twice. Then she went to her office, which is what she did when she needed to make decisions without an audience. She was in there for 2 hours. When she came out, she went to the lower kitchen. Marcus was finishing the evening meal rotation. The legume dish had been portioned and was in the serving rotation for the second shift. He was cleaning down the prep counter, using the slightly too cold ceramic surface that made your fingers ache, working with the same unshowy efficiency he always worked with. Valen Dra sat down on the other side of the counter. "I need to know," she said, "why you really applied to the integration program." He kept cleaning. "I told you." "You told me the structural reason, the institutional reason. I'm asking about the personal one." He stopped cleaning, looked at her, and I was in the room. I'd come back down to file my notes and stayed, I admit, because I understood that something was concluding, and I watched him make the decision I'd seen him make a dozen times. How honest to be. He said, "Because I spent 11 years in a war and I believed in what I was fighting for. And then the war ended, and I looked up and realized that believing in something and knowing how to live in the peace it produced are two completely different skills. And I didn't have the second one yet." Valen Dra was quiet. "The kitchen teaches you," he said. You learn what people actually need instead of what they say they need. You learn patience. You learn that most problems look completely different at a different temperature. He paused. And you get to feed people without anyone dying. She said, you could have been an advisor, a consultant. Someone asked you, I assume, to take a role that matched your actual expertise. Several people asked me, he said. Many times. Why not? He looked at the counter. Because the version of me that those roles would have needed was the version that made all those decisions, and I needed to see if there was a version that didn't have to. I think about what Valen Draw did next every time someone asks me whether leadership is a species-specific trait, whether it's something that only humans value or only Vale, or whether it's something that recognizes itself across the divide of biology and culture and the vast inconvenient fact of interstellar distance. She told him the truth. She said that she was required, under Confederation integration protocols, to report his presence and his identity to the Oversight Board within the next 48 hours, because the non-disclosure he'd operated under was a protocol violation that had implications for the program's integrity. She told him this clearly and without softening it. Then she said that she also intended to recommend, in the same report, a formal review of the integration program's staffing framework based on the observations he'd made in the lower kitchen. She said that his 3 concerns about the program's structural vulnerabilities were, in her assessment, accurate and important, and that they needed to be on record with attribution. His attribution, his name, his actual name. Because the kind of observations he'd made deserved to be taken seriously, and anonymous observations from an unnamed auxiliary wouldn't get the attention they required. She said, if you're going to be in this, you should be in it as yourself. He looked at her for a long time. He said, that's what you want from me. She said, I want from you what I've been getting for the past 5 months. Honest information, delivered without performance. I just want it with your actual name attached. The formal report went to integration oversight 4 days later. It was, by the accounts of people who deal with Confederation bureaucracy professionally, an unusual document. It identified the protocol violation clearly, recommended a disciplinary review of the screening process that had allowed the violation to occur. Note, the screening process, not the individual, and included a 40-page technical assessment of the integration program's structural vulnerabilities authored by Marcus Hale, formerly known as Warlord, commanding officer of the Northern Reclamation Alliance, now serving as Human Auxiliary, Grade 3, Culinary Services, aboard the Vale Dominion. It also included a personal endorsement from Commander Valen Draw, which read, in full, the assessment contained in this document is the most accurate analysis of this program's functioning that I have received in 18 months of command. I am aware of the author's history. I believe it is relevant to note that his history is precisely why his analysis is worth reading. The Integration Oversight Board convened an emergency session. The disciplinary review concluded that the screening failure was a systemic problem in how the program had defined military personnel. The definition had been written around active duty status and current operational authority, neither of which technically applied to Marcus. The board recommended a definitional revision and did not find Marcus personally in violation. More significantly, the board convened a working group to address his 3 structural concerns. He chaired the working group. From a kitchen, they gave him a small office adjacent to the lower kitchen of the Dominion, and he used both. Part 6, the weight of a room. There's a particular quality that leadership has, real leadership, the kind that doesn't come from rank or position or the formal architecture of authority, but from something harder to name and impossible to fabricate, that I think I finally understood watching Marcus Hale operate in the months after his identity became known. The crew of the Dominion, Vale and human alike, responded to the revelation in various ways. There were Vale officers who were unsettled by the idea that a person of his operational history had been in their kitchen for 6 months, and their discomfort was legitimate, and I don't dismiss it. There were human auxiliaries who were thrilled, who felt that having the Warlord on board was a kind of validation, which Marcus found actively annoying and said so plainly. There were people who didn't know enough history to have a strong reaction and went on eating his food, which he seemed to consider the most appropriate response. What I watched happen over the following months was this: the working group made progress, real progress. The kind that's hard to achieve in institutional settings, because it requires the people doing the work to trust each other enough to say the honest thing instead of the useful thing. Marcus ran the group the way he cooked, without waste, without performance, with absolute attention to what was actually in the room rather than what was supposed to be in the room. He was not diplomatic in the conventional sense. He didn't smooth things over. When there was disagreement, he let the disagreement be present until it had been actually addressed rather than papered over. Twice, he ended sessions early because he could tell the room was performing agreement rather than reaching it, and the next sessions began with a directness that was uncomfortable and productive. Vailendra attended several of the working group sessions as an observer. She never spoke during them. Her presence was enough of a presence that speaking would have shifted the group's center of gravity. But she was there, watching, and afterward she would stop by the kitchen for the conversation that had become, by that point, simply a habit between two people who had each found in each other someone who told the truth. I was not privy to those conversations, but I was nearby often enough to catch fragments, and what I noticed was that the conversations ranged widely, from the working group's progress to the broader state of the integration program to, sometimes, things that had nothing to do with work at all. Marcus talked about the reclamation zones, about the way a landscape recovers after being fought over, about specific meals he'd learned to make in specific circumstances and what those circumstances had been. Vailendra talked about the Ember Belt incident, which she never discussed with anyone else, and about the peculiar burden of being the person in a room whose decisions other people have to live with. Two people learning, in real time, the skill of living in the peace after the war. Vrenkos contacted the Dominion again, 7 months after the initial encounter. This time he requested a formal diplomatic meeting, through proper channels, with Commander Vailendra as host and Marcus Hale as a formal party to the discussion. He brought a different configuration, a single diplomatic vessel, no interceptors, and the meeting was held via secure comlink from the Dominion's secondary conference room, which Vailendra had asked Marcus to help set up, and which he had furnished, among other things, with a table from the kitchen because it was the right height and the conference room's standard table was not. The discussion was about the integration program. The Kreth had been observing it with the same patient attention they applied to everything, and Vrenkos had conclusions he wanted to share. His central observation was that the program's fundamental design had a paradox at its core. It was trying to build trust between species by keeping them in roles that limited how much each side could actually see of the other. The auxiliary structure, which kept humans in support positions, gave Veil crew members a relationship with human colleagues that was always slightly asymmetrical. You don't fully trust someone you've never seen make a real decision. Vrenkos said he was prepared to recommend to the Sovereignty's Diplomatic Council that a second phase of the integration program should include humans in operational and advisory roles. Not military roles, he was clear about the distinction, but roles with actual decision-making authority in shared operations. He said the recommendation would be based substantially on the example of the Dominion's working group. He also said, directly to Marcus, "It appears I was correct to read you as a level 7. Marcus said, "I don't know what that means for you, but for me it mostly means I've made a lot of mistakes and I'm still here." Vrenkos said, "That is precisely what it means for us as well." Part 7, what actually happened? I said at the beginning that the story people want is the battle, the speech, the shockwave, the confrontation in the command bay. There wasn't a battle. There wasn't a speech. The confrontation, if you can call it that, happened in a kitchen, and it was conducted in the tone of people trying to be accurate with each other rather than impressive. But there was a shockwave. It was just slower than people expect shockwaves to be. The kind of wave that moves through the deep structure of things rather than the surface. The working group's recommendations were adopted across the integration program within 14 months. 17 vessels modified their auxiliary structures. The definitional revision to the program's military personnel screening became a formal policy change. Humans in the second phase of the program began serving in roles that had actual operational weight. The Kreth Sovereignty formally began integration negotiations with the Confederation 2 years after the Dominion encounter. The negotiations were long and complicated, and I'm not in a position to assess how much of their eventual success was traceable to the Category 1 acknowledgement that Vren Kos had extended to Marcus, or to the conversation between commanders that had taken place over a comm channel while a pot of legumes finished cooking on a kitchen stove. Probably not all of it. Maybe more of it than anyone could trace. Marcus stayed on the Dominion for another 18 months. He ran the working group and he ran the kitchen simultaneously, and he would tell you, I asked him once directly, that the kitchen mattered at least as much as the working group. He meant it. He was not performing humility. He was making the same point he'd made to Vren Kos, that the things that look small are usually the ones that matter most, because they're the ones that actually touch the most people. When he eventually left the Dominion, he transferred to the Integration Program's Oversight Board, not as an observer, as a member. His name on the official roster was Marcus Hale. His designation was Former Commanding Officer, Northern Reclamation Alliance. His listed current role was Integration Policy Advisor, Tier 1. He asked them to add a secondary notation. It read, Former Human Auxiliary, Grade 3, Culinary Services, VDS Dominion. They asked him if that was really necessary. He said it was the most important part. Epilogue, the smell of something burning. Valen Dra retired from active command 4 years after the events I've described. She took a position with the Confederation's Cultural Integration Division in a role that involved exactly the kind of systemic analysis that Marcus's working group had pioneered. She is, by all accounts, very good at it. I've seen her twice since leaving the Dominion. Once at a conference in the capital station where we talked briefly but warmly. Once at a small event that I wasn't supposed to be told about but was told about anyway, where a group of people who had been part of the Dominion's crew in that period gathered for the kind of occasion that doesn't have an official name, but that everyone understands. The occasion of recognizing that something that happened to you matters, and wanting to be in a room with the other people it happened to. Marcus was there. He had gray that had advanced from his temples into most of the rest of his hair. He was talking to Danny Ockaffer about something that made her laugh, which was always a good sound. I asked him that night if he had any regrets about how it had all come out. The revelation, the working group, the name on the board. He thought about it for a moment. Not performing the thought, actually thinking. He said, I regret that it took something like the Kreth scanner to get there. I should have figured out how to do it myself earlier. I said, the 6 months of not telling anyone. The 11 years of not knowing any other way to be useful, he said. The kitchen taught me. I should have been in a kitchen before any of the rest of it. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. He looked at the room with the people in it, the Vale and the humans and the 2 Kreth diplomatic liaisons who had come because Vren Kos had asked them to, which was itself a small piece of the future becoming visible. And he had the expression I'd come to recognize as his version of satisfied, which looked on anyone else like neutral, but which I'd learned to read. It's a good room, he said. Then someone said dinner was ready, and he was already standing up before the sentence was finished. The last thing I'll say about Marcus Hale is this. In the years after, as the integration program expanded and the second phase took hold and the shape of the galaxy began, slowly and imperfectly and with constant setbacks and the occasional step backward for every 2 steps forward, to look a little different than it had before in all of that, his name appears in enough documents and enough decisions that anyone tracing the history of how things changed would eventually find him. Level 7. Warlord, Chair of the Working Group. Tier 1 Policy Advisor. But in the lower kitchen of the Vale Dominion there is a small plaque. It wasn't officially commissioned. It was put there by Sorrel and Adon, the Vale prep technicians, who made it themselves in the ship's fabrication lab and mounted it above the prep counter with the too-cold ceramic surface. It reads in both Vale and English, M. Hale cooked here, the food was good. That's what they remembered, not the war, not the Warlord, not the Level 7 threat signature. The food was good. And I think he would tell you, if you asked him, that being remembered for that is worth more than any of the other things. That the whole point, the point of the kitchen, the point of the integration program, the point of everything he'd tried to do before and after and in between, was to produce something that could nourish people.